You know what finally made me a better woodworker? It wasn't a new tool. It wasn't a fancy jig. It was a set of rules written down over 500 years ago by men I'll never meet. A few years back, I started digging into the old European guild system, the actual records and apprenticeship documents from medieval woodworking shops. And what struck me wasn't how different their world was from ours. It was how familiar their problems were. Wood that moved, joints that failed, projects that fell apart because somebody skipped a step. But these craftsmen had strict rules for dealing with every one of those problems. Rules that apprentices had to follow for years before they were even allowed to build on their own. And when I started applying those same rules in my own shop, the difference was immediate. Today, I'm going to walk you through 10 medieval woodworking rules that still hold up after centuries. And if you follow them, I promise your work will get better. Plus, stick around to the end because I've got a layout trick straight from a guild workshop that most modern woodworkers have never heard of. Let's get into it. The medieval guild system produced some of the finest furniture and timber framing the world has ever seen. And the remarkable thing is, the core principles behind that work are not outdated. They are just forgotten. Once you hear these rules and understand the reasoning behind them, you will wonder why nobody taught you this on day one. So let me start with where these rules actually came from. Between roughly the 12th and 17th centuries, woodworking across England, France, and the German-speaking regions was controlled almost entirely by craft guilds. If you wanted to build furniture or work timber professionally, you didn't just hang a sign and start taking orders. You entered a guild as an apprentice, usually around age 12 or 13, and you spent anywhere from 4 to 7 years under the direct supervision of a master, craftsman. Every day, every task, every joint. And the guild had strict standards for what was acceptable work and what was not. If a finished piece didn't meet those standards, it could be confiscated or destroyed. The craftsman could be fined or even expelled. So these weren't suggestions, they were rules, enforced with real consequences. What I find fascinating is that when you look at guild records from London and compare them to records from Nuremberg or Paris, the same core principles show up again and again. Different languages, different traditions, but the same fundamental understanding of how wood behaves and how a craftsman should work with it. These men figured out through centuries of trial and error exactly what matters most, and they boiled it down to a set of non-negotiable rules. Here are 10 of them. Rule number 1. Always read the grain before you make a single cut. In a guild workshop, an apprentice was expected to study a board before he ever picked up a tool. He'd look at the end grain to understand how the tree grew. He'd sight down the face to find any twist or bow. He'd run his hand along the surface to feel which direction the fibers ran. This wasn't ritual, it was practical. If you plane against the grain, you get tear out. If you ignore a twist, your joinery won't seat properly. Medieval craftsmen working with European oak and beech, woods with strong, prominent grain patterns, learned this the hard way. I spent years just grabbing a board and cutting to my marks. The day I started reading every board first, my tear out dropped by at least half. It takes 30 seconds and it changes everything. Rule number 2. Never use green wood for joinery. The guilds were absolutely rigid on this. Green timber had its place in rough construction and certain bending operations, but any piece destined for fine joinery had to be air-dried. In medieval Europe, that meant stacking lumber with stickers, those small spacer strips between boards, and letting it sit for at least 1 year per inch of thickness, sometimes longer. They understood that green wood shrinks as it dries, and if you cut a tight mortise and tenon while the wood is still wet, that joint is going to loosen and fail within a season. I made this mistake early on with some fresh-cut white oak, cut beautiful dovetails. 3 months later, I could slide a playing card into the gaps. The guild rule was simple. Let the wood dry first, no exceptions. Rule number 3. Your tools must be sharp enough to pare end grain cleanly. This was a real standard in guild workshops. A master would test an apprentice's chisel by asking him to pare a clean shaving off the end grain of a piece of oak or ash. If the tool tore the fibers instead of slicing them, it wasn't sharp enough. Period. And a dull tool wasn't just an inconvenience. It was considered a safety hazard and a sign of laziness. I'll be honest, I used to think my tools were sharp until I tried this test myself. I couldn't get a clean end grain shaving to save my life. I went back to my sharpening stones, worked through the grits properly, and the difference in my joinery was startling. Cleaner shoulders, tighter fits, less time spent fussing with adjustments. The medieval rule was that you sharpen before you start, and you sharpen again whenever the tool stops performing. Not at the end of the day, right then. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking, the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Rule number 4. Always work from a face side and a face edge. This is one of the most important principles in the entire guild system, and it's the one I see modern woodworkers skip most often. In a medieval shop, before any joinery was laid out, the craftsman would prepare one face of the board dead flat and one edge square to it. He'd mark the face side and face edge with specific symbols, and every single measurement on that board would be taken from those two reference surfaces. Never from the opposite side. Never from a rough edge. The reason is simple. If your reference surfaces aren't true, every measurement you take is a lie. It compounds. By the time you've marked out 3 or 4 joints, you can be off by a 1/16 of an inch or more and nothing fits. Once I committed to this rule, my projects started going together with a precision that honestly surprised me. Rule number 5. Never rush a glue joint. The guilds used animal hide glue almost exclusively, and it required careful preparation. The glue had to be heated. To the right consistency, the joint surfaces had to be clean and freshly fitted, and the assembly had to be clamped before the glue cooled and gelled. There was no margin for sloppy work. But the deeper rule here isn't about hide glue specifically. It's about respecting the glue-up process. Medieval craftsmen always did a full dry assembly first. Every clamp in position, every joint checked. Then and only then did they mix the glue and commit. I can't tell you how many projects I've nearly ruined by skipping the dry fit. You think everything lines up, you spread the glue, and suddenly one shoulder doesn't seat, or you're short a clamp. The guild rule was rehearse the assembly completely before any adhesive touches the wood. Rule number 6. Let the wood acclimate before you dimension it. This goes beyond just drying the wood. Even properly seasoned lumber needs time to adjust to the environment where it will be worked. In a guild shop, boards brought in from the timber yard would sit inside the workshop for days or even weeks before anyone touched them. The wood needed to reach equilibrium with the humidity in the room. If you dimension a board that hasn't acclimated, it will continue to move after you've milled it flat, and you'll be chasing twist and cup all over again. I keep my rough lumber in the shop for at least 2 weeks before I start milling. After rough cutting to approximate size, I let it sit again for another 2 or 3 days, then do the final dimensioning. It feels slow, but it saves enormous frustration later. Rule number 7. Always cut on the waist side of the line. This sounds obvious, but the guilds treated it as sacred. Your scribed line is your finished dimension. You never cut into it. You cut next to it on the waist side, and then you pare or plane down to the line carefully. The line itself should still be barely visible on your finished piece. A medieval apprentice who cut through his line would have to start over. Not because the master was cruel, but because that habit, once formed, leads to sloppy work for a lifetime. I started paying strict attention to this about 5 years ago, and my joints improved more from this single discipline than from any new technique I've learned. Rule number 8. Measure twice, but transfer dimensions directly whenever possible. Here's something that surprised me when I studied guild methods. They actually measured less than we do. Not because they were careless, but because they understood that every time you measure with a rule and transfer a number, you introduce error. Instead, they used dividers, story sticks, and direct marking whenever they could. If a tenon needed to fit a mortise, they'd mark the mortise width directly onto the tenon stock, using the actual mortise as the reference. No numbers involved. I've started using dividers and story sticks in my own shop, and my accuracy has improved noticeably. A steel rule is useful, but direct transfer is almost always more reliable. Rule number 9. Never neglect the finish on surfaces you cannot see. In a guild workshop, the back of a cabinet received the same care as the front. The inside of a drawer was planed smooth. The underside of a table was sealed. This wasn't vanity. It was structural. Wood absorbs and releases moisture from every exposed surface. If you finish only the outside of a panel and leave the inside raw, moisture moves unevenly and the panel warps or cracks. I learned this lesson the hard way on a bookcase I built about 15 years ago. Beautiful face, raw back. Within a year, the sides had bowed noticeably. Now I finish every surface, seen or unseen. The medieval craftsmen understood wood moisture science better than most of us give them credit for. Rule number 10. Spend more time planning than building. This might be the most important rule of all. In the guild system, a journeyman seeking master status had to produce a masterpiece, a single project that demonstrated complete command of the craft. And before he was allowed to cut a single board, he had to present detailed drawings and a complete plan to the guild elders for approval. The planning phase could take weeks. The guilds understood that mistakes made in planning cost nothing. Mistakes made in wood cost material, time, and reputation. I now spend at least a third of my total project time on planning, drawing, making cut lists, thinking through the assembly sequence. Every hour of planning saves me 3 hours of problem solving at the bench. Now let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that these medieval rules address head on. No judgment here. I did all of these for longer than I'd like to admit. The first pattern is reaching for power tools before thinking about the wood. Most of us fire up the planer and start milling without even looking at the grain direction. The guild approach says stop, study the board, then decide how to work it. That one pause prevents half the problems we blame on our tools. The second pattern is treating the glue up as an afterthought. We spend hours on joinery and then rush through assembly with glue dripping everywhere and not enough clamps. The medieval rule of always rehearsing the full assembly first eliminates that panic entirely. The third pattern is measuring everything with a tape measure or rule. We write down numbers, transfer them, round them off, and wonder why things don't fit. The guild method of direct transfer using dividers and story sticks is faster and more accurate. I wish someone had told me that 30 years ago. The fourth pattern is skipping the finish on hidden surfaces. It feels like wasted effort until the first time a panel cracks because you only sealed one side. The guilds knew that wood doesn't care whether you can see it or not. Moisture moves through every surface. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. You don't have to overhaul your entire shop. Just pick one rule and commit to it on your next build. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is a layout method I found referenced in guild apprenticeship records, and I've never seen it taught in any modern woodworking class. When medieval craftsmen needed to divide a board into equal parts, say they needed to mark 5 evenly spaced dovetails across a board that was an odd width, they didn't do the math. They took a straight edge, angled it across the board so that it spanned a measurement easily divisible by 5, say 10 inches, and made their marks at 2, 4, 6, and 8. Then they squared those marks across the board. Perfect equal divisions every time, no fractions, no calculator. I started using this about 3 years ago, and it has saved me more time and frustration than I can describe. It works for any number of divisions on any width board. Just angle your rule until the ear. Math is simple. Those old guild craftsmen were brilliant at finding elegant solutions to everyday problems. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best traditional woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called The Lost Workshop. 17 chapters of medieval hand tool techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with 33 illustrations and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and if you want more of these deep dives, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next one.